The dispute over links between a paedophile group and a civil liberties organisation in which Labour politicians were prominent in the 1970s and early 1980s rumbles on. This morning, former chairman of PI, the Paedophile Information Exchange, which was affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties in the 1970s, suggested that Harriet Harman, Labour's deputy leader, and the former Cabinet Minister Patricia Hewitt didn't try to kick out the group because they didn't want to rock the boat. Tom O'Carroll, who was later jailed over child pornography, told the Today programme that Hewitt had expressed distaste for his views, but that there'd been no active attempt to remove him from one of the NCCL's subcommittees. In a statement, Miss Harman's husband, the Labour MP Jack Dromey, said PI had been completely marginalised within the National Council for Civil Liberties after 1976. Harriet Harman says she regrets links between the two organisations, but doesn't have anything to apologise for. Well, PI was disbanded in the mid-1980s. The Labour MP Tom Watson, who's been campaigning on the issue, has been telling me why he thinks there's more to discover about its activities.
Because it was a sort of pseudo-academic, high-end establishment organisation that we now know contained a number of very high-profile child abusers. There will be many victims out there who will be looking at this debacle and thinking, well, here we go again. Moral outrage in the tabloid newspapers, politicians sort of wringing their hands, but they're not getting any progress on their individual cases. And no one is talking about the victims here, which is a great shame. And this has happened before, of course.
There is a Home Office inquiry at the moment, isn't there, into an allegation you'd raised that possibly PI was funded at some point by public money, or at least partly funded by public money channelled through the Home Office.
Yes, this is as a result of a former civil servant who told me that he'd seen documents in the late 70s, early 80s that suggested there was going to be a grant from a thing called the Voluntary Services Unit to PI, and he expressed his concern at the time. I wrote to Theresa May about it, and she's ordered the Permanent Secretary to review the files from that time, but that was 2 months ago, and we've not heard anything since.
And some suggestions that a lot of that information may no longer exist.
Well, the problem with these historic cases is it is very difficult to track down the information, but I've been struck over the last sort of year and a half, just how much information has gone missing. You know, there were dossiers presented to the former Home Secretary Leon Britton by Geoffrey Dickens MP, a former Conservative MP, where he'd made specific allegations of child abuse relating to some PI members in the early 1980s. And the Home Office have also confirmed that those documents have gone missing. So it's very difficult for the police who are trying to sort of piece this information together. And, I would hope that Theresa May is concerned as I am that this information seems to have gone missing on quite a large scale.
I suppose then the question of how this story has surfaced once again, you said it's turned into a bit of a fight between, the politicians and the media. But would you argue that it's legitimate ground for newspapers and journalists in general to be looking at again?
Look, I think it's perfectly reasonable that there's a debate about sort of politics of the libertarian left at the time and whether that allowed whether it allows some of these sort of insidious groups like PI to try and get their message over in some kind of covert way. But I have been taken aback by these front page headlines. Because I would hope that the Daily Mail has usually got quite a proud record of trying to expose child abuse cases rather than sort of apportion blame on individuals for whether they allowed people to speak or not.
Are you satisfied with the explanations you've heard from Harriet Harman over the last day or so about the links between the National Council for Civil Liberties and PI?
To be honest, I've almost lost the will to live to follow this story, so I've not followed it in detail. But I think Harriet Harman is perfectly capable of defending herself, and she doesn't need me to come onto your show, Sean, to defend her. If she wants to sort of speak out and put her case, she's perfectly entitled to do so.
The NCCL was a prominent organisation, a campaigning organisation. PI was affiliated to it. I mean, that is, in a sense, part of what you talked about as the establishment story of PI and the insidious role it played. And I wondered if you therefore felt that we know enough about that now as a result of what's been said over the last few days.
Well, she can explain for herself why PI ended up being part of that organisation. It's not something that I was involved in. I can just tell you my personal view that I wouldn't have touched them with a barge pole.
The Labour MP Tom Watson.